Today, I'd like to take a look at the way that black soldiers were treated in the military and talk a little bit about some of the difficulties the black people have faced in America over the years and talk about how that impacts in terms of our understanding today. As we look at the idea of the soldiers and return to World War One, very interesting development was the way the French soldiers treated the black soldiers. And it was kind of interesting because the French soldiers kind of had an affectionate relationship with the black soldiers, and they seemed to enjoy being with them. And they just thought, well, let's treat the black soldiers the same way we treat any other soldiers, which kind of normal way of acting. And they said, let's just treat them in the same way. Um, but this became very upsetting to the white soldiers because a lot of them came from areas of the country where you just didn't treat black people with much respect, and they were in the lower caste, and they should be treated as somebody obviously in the lower caste. And the French soldiers were not used to this. They just thought, well, they're black, they're white, what does it matter really? Um, and so the white soldiers got into a situation where they actually literally refused to be in the same trenches. And of course, there was a lot of trench warfare going on in the First World War. They said, we just don't want to be in the same trenches, the same area as the black soldiers. So some of the commanding officers had to call over some of the French soldiers and say, hey, wait a minute, guys, this is a little bit different here in America. Black people are treated in a different way by certain white people. They're just not kind of used to treating them as equals. And so, this isn't a good situation. It's going to cause problems in terms of morale, in terms of, tension with the troops and stuff. And we don't want to see that. It's going to really be bad news for our war effort. So they decided that the French soldiers would treat the black soldiers in a kind of a different way. And it was tough for them at first to kind of get used to that, but they said, well, we kind of have to go along with what the American command really wants. And it was interesting in the First World War that two black soldiers were nominated for the Medal of Honor, Private Burton Holmes and Freddie Stowers, but it wasn't granted to the black soldiers because really, how could the dominant caste acknowledge that level of bravery was accomplished by two men who were from the lower caste? It would kind of cast a little doubt about this whole caste system because, they're lower than us. And so why should they get a Medal of Honor? So they were not granted the Medal of Honor. Another story that kind of shows a little bit of this dynamic and this whole sense of caste and being treated differently was at the end of the Second World War. And Sergeant Isaac Woodward was a hero during the Second World War, but he wasn't treated as a hero as many black soldiers weren't when they returned home and into areas where Jim Crow was very prevalent, and it was thought, we're not going to treat them as heroes, certainly. We're going to treat them in the way we've always treated black people. So Sergeant Woodward was in Boston driving home to his home after the war, and he asked to go to the bathroom, to get off the bus and to go to the bathroom. He's driving on a bus that there was no bathroom in, and the bus driver said, "Hey, you're black. You can't do that. That's not right." So he pulled up to an area where he would be getting off, and the bus driver had alerted the police in the town, and the police blinded him with a baton in the eye because he had the nerve to ask the bus to stop and to get off the bathroom. As a black man, this was not allowed. This was not acceptable. Now, when this happened, the charges were brought against the police in this situation. President Truman intervened, wanted a trial to, take place, but the jury found the policeman not guilty of certainly something that was obvious, flagrantly wrong. But again, it was an all-white jury. But out of this trial came a very interesting development in the sense that the judge who was involved in the trial saw the terrible miscarriage of justice that had just taken place. And he actually advocated for better relationships with white and black people, and part of his advocacy led to the Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education decision, which led to the desegregation of schools. So from this very negative experience, something positive happened. And many times we see this in terms of change attitude on the part of how we treat people of a different race. That when there is this miscarriage of justice, there are people who say, "Wait a minute, this isn't good. This is not fair, and we have to change things." And as we notice, change does not come sometimes in very dramatic ways. It takes a while for change to be accepted. Another example in terms of how blacks were treated in America was the massacre in Oakey, Florida on Election Day of 1920, and was started. Why? Because a black man had the nerve to try to vote. We also noticed that anti-black pogroms took place in several cities in the North after the Great Migration from the South. So it wasn't just a sense of South, doing these things, enacting these laws. There was also situations in the North in terms of this acceptance. And we see this many times. We think of the South and we put a certain label, and we think of it, but it's much more complex than that, certainly. The Tulsa riots, for example, in 1921, targeted an area that was developed by wealthy black business people called Black Wall Street. This area was quite prosperous. Businesses were doing well. But again, there's this resentment. Whenever there is this progress that can happen, when there are changes, when it seems that people from the lower caste are getting an upper hand, they're doing better, naturally there are these resentments that build up, and it can lead to some terrible situations. We speak of this in terms of a backlash, a white backlash or a backlash against a certain race or group. In March of 1892, for example, a prosperous black grocery store owner who was doing very well, had a great business going, and two of his clerks were killed in a dispute. And the dispute was not in relationship to the store or anything, but a dispute over an argument between a black and a white child. And the black child was the child of this grocery store owner, and it was thought that, why is he arguing with a white child? Doesn't he know his place? And it led to this idea that we have to take retaliation. We have to show those in the black community what their proper place is. And of course, many times that was the input of what had happened. That this caste system must stay in place. Blacks have a certain place. Stay in that place. As long as they stay in that place and know their place, that's fine. But when they try to kind of exceed that in some way, and here was a child. He's like, well, this kid is treating me in a bad way. They get into an argument. He's not thinking black, white, color. He's just a kid, right? But again, not knowing your place, the consequences of that. Another example in terms of that is the cure for smallpox. The vaccination with a specimen fluid from an infected person was brought to America by Cotton Mather's slave, Onesimus. But he was never really given any credit for it, because it was thought that, he was just a slave. And so to say a slave could lead to this type of cure, that was not thought that, that should be a claim, because he is just a slave. Another example in terms of the disparity, Black servants who were traveling with white children could ride in a white section of a bus, a white section of a train. Again, you might say, well, this doesn't make sense. I mean, because we're saying black people can't ride in it, but if the black servant is with a white child, well, there's an exception here, because again, he's with a white child. So some of these disparities of treatment in the military, some of these problems that have occurred in terms of trying to keep people in their rightful place led to tension, as we see. And of course, today we're working very conscientiously to overcome those inequalities that can exist in our society. We look at it kind of differently from a different perspective.